May 5, 1945. Castle Itter, Austrian Alps. Captain Jack Lee, Jr. of the United States Army's 23rd Tank Battalion stood in the courtyard of a 13th-century fortress and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. German Wehrmacht Soldaten, men who should have been his enemies, were manning defensive positions alongside his own troops. French politicians in civilian clothes were loading rifles. A tennis star was preparing to vault over the castle walls under fire. And approaching from the valley below, a full SS division was moving into attack positions with orders to execute everyone inside. This is impossible. 5 days after Hitler's death, 2 days before the surrender, and I'm about to fight alongside Germans to protect French prisoners from other Germans? The castle itself was a medieval marvel. Thick stone walls rising 60 meters above the valley floor. A single narrow access road winding up the mountainside. Defensive positions that had held against sieges for 7 centuries. But Lee knew medieval fortifications meant nothing against modern weapons. His force numbered roughly 24 men, 12 Americans, 10 to 15 Wehrmachtsoldaten, and 1 M4 Sherman tank nicknamed Besatten Jenny. Against them, an estimated 100-150 battle-hardened Waffen-SS troops with machine guns, Panzerfausts, and an 88mm anti-tank gun already positioned on the heights. The prisoners they were defending represented the highest echelons of French political and military power. Former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud. General Maurice Gamelin, who had commanded all French forces in 1940. General Maxime Weygand, Gamelin's successor. Marie-Agnès Callot, Charles de Gaulle's older sister. And Jean Borotra, the bounding Basque, one of France's most celebrated tennis champions. Lee looked at the German officer beside him, Major Josef Sepp Gangl, wearing the uniform of the Wehrmacht. 24 hours ago, they had been enemies. Now Gangl was coordinating defensive positions with the calm professionalism of a career officer who had made his choice: to defend innocent lives against the fanaticism consuming his own country in its final hours. What Lee didn't yet know was that he was about to command the only battle in World War II where American and German soldiers would fight side by side as allies, and that before this day ended, one of them would die a hero. The journey to this surreal moment had begun 4 years earlier, when the Third Reich was at the height of its power and France had just fallen. Castle Itter, located near Würgl in the Tyrol region of Austria, had been requisitioned by the SS in 1943 for a specific purpose: to serve as a high-security prison for French VIPs, political prisoners deemed too prominent to execute but too dangerous to release. The castle was designated as a subcamp of Dachau concentration camp, designated Itter subcamp. Prisoner number KZ Außenlager Schloss Itter. The SS had chosen well. The castle's location was perfect for isolation, perched on a mountain ridge, accessible only by a single winding road, surrounded by steep terrain that made escape virtually impossible. Its thick medieval walls could be easily guarded by a small detachment, and its remote location in Austria, far from Allied bombing routes, made rescue or liberation unlikely. Between 1943 and 1945, the castle held a rotating roster of France's most significant political prisoners. Édouard Daladier had been Prime Minister of France from 1938 to 1940, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement and declared war on Germany in September 1939. Paul Reynaud had succeeded him as Prime Minister in March 1940 and led France during the catastrophic Battle of France. After the fall of Paris, both men had been arrested by the Vichy government and eventually handed over to the Germans. The military prisoners were equally significant. General Maurice Gamelin had been supreme commander of the French armed forces and architect of the failed strategy that led to France's defeat in 1940. General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced Gamelin during the battle, had served as commander-in-chief during France's darkest hour. Both men possessed intimate knowledge of French military capabilities, Allied strategic thinking, and the failures that had led to France's collapse. Also imprisoned were Michel Clemenceau, son of the legendary French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, François Delaroque, leader of the French Social Party, Jean Borotra, the tennis champion who had won Wimbledon and multiple Grand Slam titles, and Marie-Agnès Caillou, whose brother Charles de Gaulle now led Free France from exile. The prisoners lived in relative comfort compared to typical concentration camp inmates. They had beds, adequate food, and were not subjected to forced labor. But they were under no illusions. They were hostages, kept alive only as long as they had political value. And as the Third Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, that value was rapidly approaching zero. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. On May 2nd, Berlin fell to the Soviet army. The same day, the SS guards at Castle Itter, sensing the war's end, abandoned their posts, simply walking away and leaving the prisoners unguarded. For a brief moment, the French prisoners were free, but their celebration was short-lived. The prisoners quickly realized their predicament. They were in the heart of what remained of Nazi-controlled territory, surrounded by Wehrmacht units, SS formations, and fanatical Nazi loyalists. They had no weapons, no transportation, no way to reach Allied lines. And they knew that as the regime collapsed, radical SS elements might decide to eliminate all witnesses to Nazi crimes. They needed protection, and they needed it fast. The prisoners' fears were not unfounded. Across Germany and Austria in those final days, SS units and Nazi fanatics were conducting a frenzy of last-minute executions, determined to eliminate prisoners, political enemies, and anyone who might testify to their crimes. On April 29, SS guards at Dachau had executed Soviet prisoners even as American forces approached. On May 2, Cap Arcona, a ship loaded with concentration camp prisoners, was bombed in Lübeck Bay. Over 5,000 died. In towns across southern Germany, SS execution squads were hunting down escaped prisoners, deserters, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. The pattern was clear. The SS was not surrendering gracefully. Elements of the Waffen-SS, particularly those from elite divisions, remained fanatically loyal to Nazi ideology, even as the regime collapsed around them. These were not ordinary soldiers ready to go home. They were true believers who saw surrender as betrayal. And Castle Itter, with its high-profile French prisoners, was exactly the kind of target that would attract their attention. On May 3, the day after the guards fled, the prisoners made contact with the outside world. Zvonimir Chuchkovich, a Yugoslav handyman who had worked at the castle, volunteered to cycle 15 kilometers to the nearest town, Virgil, to seek help. The journey was extraordinarily dangerous. Deserters, desperate soldiers, and SS patrols roamed the roads. But Chuchkovich made it. In Virgil, he found an unlikely savior, Major Josef Sepp Gangl of the Wehrmacht. Gangl was a career German officer, 42 years old, who had served throughout the war on the Eastern Front and in Italy. But by May 1945, Gangl had become thoroughly disillusioned with the Nazi regime. He had witnessed SS atrocities. He had seen the senseless destruction of the war's final months. And he had made contact with the Austrian resistance, secretly working to prevent further bloodshed as the Reich collapsed. When Chuchkovich arrived with news of the undefended French prisoners, Gangl made his decision immediately. He would go to Castle Itter with his men, approximately 10 to 15 Wehrmacht soldiers who had similarly refused to flee, and defend the prisoners against any SS attack. But Gangl knew his small force might not be enough. He needed Allied help. On May 4, Gangl made contact with elements of the American 12th Armored Division, which was pushing through the region. The division had been encountering scattered resistance from die-hard Nazi units, but mostly they were accepting surrenders and trying to restore order. When word reached Captain Jack Lee, Jr., commanding a reconnaissance unit of Company B, 23rd Tank Battalion, he found the situation almost unbelievable. Germans asking Americans to help them defend French prisoners against other Germans? But Lee checked with his superiors, and the orders came back: investigate and render assistance if the situation was genuine. Lee assembled a small force, 12 men from his reconnaissance unit and one M4 Sherman tank, battle-hardened Jenny, commanded by Sergeant William Elliott. On the afternoon of May 4, Lee's small American force met up with Gangl's Wehrmacht troops outside Castle Itter. In any other circumstances, they would have been enemies. Now, they were allies. Together, the combined American-German force moved up the mountain road to Castle Itter, arriving in the evening. The French prisoners, initially terrified to see German soldiers, were stunned to learn they had come to defend them. Lee and Gangl immediately began organizing the castle's defense, knowing an SS attack could come at any moment. But by the evening of May 4, the tactical picture had become clear. They were not strong enough. Lee and Gangl conducted a defensive assessment of Castle Itter. The medieval fortifications offered some advantages: thick stone walls, elevated position, limited approaches. But against modern weapons, those advantages were marginal. The castle's main gate was wooden, vulnerable to explosive charges or concentrated fire. The walls, while thick, could be scaled or breached. And the defenders' ammunition was limited, perhaps enough for a few hours of sustained combat, but no more. The mathematics were brutally simple. Lee had 12 Americans with M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and limited ammunition. Gangl had 10 to 15 Wehrmacht soldiers with Kar 98K rifles and a few MP40 submachine guns. One Sherman tank with perhaps 50 rounds of main gun ammunition and a few thousand rounds for its machine guns. Against them, intelligence reports suggested at least 100-150 Waffen-SS troops from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen, equipped with machine guns, Panzerfausts, and at least one 88mm anti-tank gun. Lee radioed back to the 142nd Infantry Regiment, requesting immediate reinforcement. But the regiment was scattered across the region, and coordinating a relief force would take time, perhaps 12 to 24 hours. Lee and Gangl would have to hold until help arrived. The defenders organized their positions through the night of May 4-5. The Sherman tank battle-hardened Jenny was positioned inside the courtyard, its gun covering the main approach road. American and German soldiers were distributed along the walls, each position carefully sighted to cover potential attack routes. The French prisoners, career soldiers and politicians alike, insisted on taking part in the defense. General Weygand, despite being 78 years old, took up a rifle. Tennis star Jean Borotra, ever the athlete, volunteered to act as a courier, ready to vault the castle walls and sprint for help if the situation became desperate. At approximately 4 a.m. on May 5, 1945, the first SS scouts were spotted approaching the castle. The battle began with probing attacks, small groups of SS troops testing the defenses, trying to identify weak points. The defenders held fire, conserving ammunition. Then, at approximately 5:30, the main assault began. SS troops, estimated at 100 to 150 men, advanced up the access road and began taking positions in the surrounding forest and buildings. Their 88mm anti-tank gun, positioned on high ground approximately 800 meters away, opened fire, its first round slamming into the castle's outer walls with devastating force.
The 88 was one of the war's most feared weapons, capable of penetrating any Allied tank's armor. Against stone walls, its shells exploded with terrifying concussive force, showering defenders with rock fragments. Besotten Jemmy returned fire, Sergeant Elliott traversing the turret to engage SS positions. The Sherman's 75mm gun was outranged by the 88mm, but Elliott was skilled, dropping high explosive rounds onto suspected SS positions with precision. For the next hour, a desperate artillery duel played out, the SS-88 seeking to knock out the Sherman while Elliott suppressed SS infantry positions. At approximately 6:45, the 88 found its mark. A shell struck Besotten Jenny directly, penetrating the turret armor. The tank erupted in flames. Sergeant Elliott and his crew barely escaped before ammunition began cooking off inside. The tank transformed into a blazing pyre in the castle courtyard. The loss of the Sherman was catastrophic. Without its firepower, the defenders had no way to suppress the SS-88 or engage enemy positions beyond rifle range. Lee ordered all defenders to pull back to the inner walls, consolidating their positions. Ammunition was running critically low. Some positions were down to fewer than 20 rounds per man. At approximately 9 a.m., the SS launched their second major assault. Infantry, supported by machine gun fire, rushed the main gate. The wooden gate, weakened by 88mm fire, began to splinter. Defenders poured fire into the attackers, and hand-to-hand combat erupted as SS troops attempted to breach the entrance. It was during this desperate fighting that Major Gangl saw French prisoner Paul Reynaud, the former prime minister, exposed to fire near a window. Gangl rushed forward, pushing Reynaud to safety. As he did, an SS sniper's bullet struck Gangl in the head. He died instantly, a German officer killed while defending French prisoners against his own countrymen. The death of Gangl shocked both German and American defenders, but there was no time to mourn. The SS assault continued, and the gate was failing.
Jean Borotra, the tennis star, made his move. While defenders laid down covering fire, Borotra, drawing on the athleticism that had made him a champion, vaulted over the castle's rear wall and sprinted down the mountain, dodging SS fire. His mission, to reach the American lines and guide the relief force directly to Castle Itter. By 10:30, the defenders were nearly out of ammunition. The gate was breached. SS troops were inside the outer courtyard. Lee organized a final defensive position inside the castle's keep, preparing for a last stand. Then, at approximately 11, the sound of engines echoed up the valley. The 142nd Infantry Regiment, guided by Borotra, had arrived. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and over 100 infantry. They smashed into the SS positions from the rear, catching the attackers completely by surprise. Within 30 minutes, the SS assault collapsed. Some troops surrendered, others fled into the mountains. The siege of Castle Itter was over. The Battle of Castle Itter was not an accident of history. It was the direct result of choices made by individuals confronting impossible situations as a regime collapsed. Major Josef Gangl's decision to defend the prisoners stemmed from his rejection of Nazi ideology and his embrace of basic humanity. Gangl had spent the war serving the German state, but by 1945 he recognized that the state had become criminal. His choice was between following orders, which might have meant abandoning the prisoners to SS execution squads, or acting according to conscience. He chose conscience, knowing it might cost his life. Captain Jack Lee Jr.'s decision was equally significant. Lee had no orders requiring him to defend Castle Itter. The war was effectively over, and his mission was reconnaissance, not combat. When Gangl approached him with the request for help, Lee could have refused, citing lack of authority or tactical risk. Instead, Lee assessed the situation, recognized the moral imperative, and committed his forces to the defense. In doing so, he violated military protocol, fighting alongside enemy soldiers to achieve a greater good, protecting innocent lives. The French prisoners' decision to fight for their own defense revealed their understanding that freedom required action. General Weygand and General Gamelin were elderly men who could have sheltered in the castle's interior. Instead, they took up arms, recognizing that their fate depended on active resistance, not passive hope. Jean Borotra's decision to vault the wall and run for help, exposing himself to SS fire, epitomized the courage required in desperate circumstances. Even the Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangl's command made individual choices. By May 1945, German soldiers faced stark options: surrender to the Allies, flee to avoid capture, join fanatical SS units making last stands, or act according to personal conscience. Gangl's men chose to stay with him, knowing they were defying the remnants of Nazi authority and risking execution if captured by SS loyalists. The SS attackers represented the opposite philosophy: absolute loyalty to ideology regardless of consequences. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen had been formed in 1943 and had fought with fanatical determination in France and Germany. Even in May 1945, with Germany's defeat certain, these troops continued fighting, not for strategic objectives, but out of ideological commitment and, likely, knowledge that surrender meant facing justice for war crimes. The contrast was stark. Gangl and Lee represented pragmatic humanism, the recognition that orders, ideology, and national loyalty were secondary to preventing the murder of innocent people. The SS attackers represented ideological absolutism, the belief that loyalty to the regime justified any action, even in the regime's final hours. This philosophical divide extended to broader questions of military ethics. What does a soldier owe to his nation when the nation has become criminal? What justifies breaking the chain of command? When does duty to humanity supersede duty to the state? Gangl answered by dying to protect former enemies. Lee answered by fighting alongside former enemies. The French prisoners answered by refusing to remain passive victims. And the Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangl's command answered by following their commander's moral choice rather than fleeing to safety. The Battle of Castle Itter became a test case for these questions, not planned or deliberate, but emerging organically from the chaos of the war's end. In a few desperate hours, individuals from 3 different nations and 2 opposing sides chose cooperation over enmity, humanity over ideology, and moral courage over rigid obedience. The immediate consequences of the Battle of Castle Itter were measured in lives saved and lost. Major Josef Gangl became the only German casualty of the battle, killed by an SS sniper while saving Paul Reynaud. His death was mourned by both German and American defenders. After the war, Gangl was recognized as a hero by the Austrian resistance and the Austrian government, which honored him for his role in protecting the prisoners and resisting Nazi fanaticism. A street in Würgl, Austria, bears his name, Major Gangl Strasse. The American forces suffered no fatalities, though several men were wounded during the fighting. Sergeant William Elliott and his tank crew escaped the destruction of Besaten Jenny, though the tank itself was a total loss. Its burned-out hull remained in the castle courtyard for days after the battle. The French prisoners all survived unharmed. Édouard Daladier, Paul Reynaud, Generals Gamelin and Weygand, Marie-Agnès Caillot, Jean Borotra, and all the other VIP prisoners were liberated without injury. They were immediately evacuated by American forces and transported to Allied-controlled territory. Within days, they were back in France, resuming their roles in French political and social life. The SS attackers suffered an estimated 20 to 30 casualties, with many more captured when the American relief force arrived. Those captured faced interrogation and, in many cases, war crimes tribunals. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division had been implicated in multiple atrocities during its service. But the broader consequences extended far beyond the immediate participants. The Battle of Castle Itter became a symbol of the complexity and chaos of the war's final days. In the standard narrative of World War II, sides were clear: Allies versus Axis, democracy versus fascism, liberation versus oppression. Castle Itter complicated that narrative. Here were German soldiers fighting against other German soldiers, American troops collaborating with enemy forces, French prisoners taking up arms alongside their former captors. The battle demonstrated that individual moral choice could transcend national allegiance. Gang's Wehrmacht soldiers had far more in common with Lee's American troops than with the SS forces attacking the castle. The dividing line was not nationality, but values, a commitment to protecting innocent life versus fanatical loyalty to a collapsing regime. Historians have debated the battle's significance. Some argue it was a minor skirmish, involving small numbers of troops and having no strategic impact on the war's outcome. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945, just 2 days after the battle. Nothing that happened at Castle Itter changed that timeline. But others point to the battle's symbolic importance. It was the only documented instance of American and German forces fighting side by side as allies during World War II. It demonstrated that even in total war, common humanity could emerge. It showed that individual soldiers could make moral choices independent of national ideology. Captain Jack Lee, Jr. was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States Army, for his role in the battle. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy near Virgil, Austria, on 5 May 1945. Captain Lee organized and led a task force which successfully defended a group of French political prisoners against numerically superior German forces, showing exceptional courage and tactical skill under fire." Jean Borotra, the tennis star whose sprint to summon reinforcements helped save the castle, returned to France and continued his tennis career. He later served as a member of the French Parliament. In interviews, he described the Battle of Castle Itter as one of his greatest victories, not on a tennis court, but in defense of human life. The French prisoners returned to varied fates. Édouard Daladier resumed political life but never regained high office. Paul Reynaud served in multiple post-war governments. Generals Gamelin and Weygand published memoirs defending their conduct during France's 1940 collapse. Marie-Agnès Caillot reunited with her brother, Charles de Gaulle, who became President of France. Castle Itter survived the battle with minimal damage. Today, it operates as a private residence and is not generally open to the public. A small plaque commemorates the battle, but the castle remains largely unknown to tourists. Those who do visit stand in the courtyard where besotten Jenny burned, walk the walls where American and German soldiers fought together, and look down the valley where the SS attacked. The stones remember what happened. The complete accounting of the Battle of Castle Itter reveals both its historical uniqueness and its human cost. Total forces engaged. Defenders, approximately 24-27 combatants. 12 American soldiers from Company B, 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. 10 to 15 Wehrmacht soldiers under Major Gangl's command. 1 M4 Sherman tank, besotten Jenny. several French prisoners who took up arms, exact number unclear, but included Generals Weygand and Gamelin. Attackers, estimated 100 to 150 Waffen-SS troops from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Guts von Berlichingen. Infantry equipped with Kar-98K rifles, MP-40 submachine guns, and MG-42 machine guns. Multiple Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. At least one 88mm anti-tank gun. Duration of battle, approximately 6 to 7 hours, 0500 to 1100, May 5, 1945. Casualties. Defenders, 1 killed, Major Josef Gangl, Wehrmacht. Several wounded, exact number unrecorded. Attackers, estimated 20-30 killed or wounded, approximately 40-60 captured. French prisoners, 0 casualties. Equipment losses. Defenders, 1 M4 Sherman tank destroyed. Attackers, unknown, but likely included the 88mm anti-tank gun captured by American relief forces. The battle's place in the broader war was microscopic. On May 5, 1945, the European theater was in its final hours. Soviet forces controlled Berlin. British and American forces occupied most of Western Germany. German Army Group Center was negotiating surrender in Czechoslovakia. The Battle of Castle Itter involved fewer than 200 combatants and had 0 strategic significance. Yet its symbolic importance outweighed its tactical insignificance. Comparative context. The Battle of Castle Itter was one of the last combat actions on European soil in World War II. Other late battles included May 2, 1945, Battle of Berlin concluded. Soviet victory. 80,000 Soviet and 100,000 German casualties. May 5, 1945, Prague uprising began. Czech resistance against German occupation. May 7, 1945, Germany signed unconditional surrender at Reims, France. May 8 to 11, 1945, small-scale fighting continued as scattered German units either surrendered or attempted to evade capture. Castle Itter was unique among these actions for the coalition of forces defending it. No other battle in World War II European theater involved formal cooperation between American and German military forces as allies against a common enemy. The philosophical difference exemplified by the battle, protecting human life versus ideological fanaticism, represented the broader choice Germany faced in May 1945. Officers like Gangl chose to reject Nazi ideology and work with former enemies to prevent further bloodshed. Units like the 17th SS continued fighting for a regime that had already lost, motivated by fanaticism, fear of justice, or refusal to accept defeat. After the war, the Battle of Castle Itter faded into obscurity. It appeared in few histories, rarely featured in documentaries, and remained largely unknown outside specialist military history circles. The participants scattered. American soldiers returned home. French prisoners resumed political careers, and Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers blended into post-war Austrian and German society. In 2013, historian Stephen Harding published The Last Battle, bringing renewed attention to Castle Itter. The book's success demonstrated enduring fascination with the story, a tale of enemies cooperating, individuals choosing conscience over orders, and humanity transcending ideology even in war. May 5, 1945, Castle Itter, Austrian Alps. Captain Jack Lee Jr. stood in the courtyard where, hours earlier, he had commanded the strangest battle of his life. The smell of burned metal from besotted Jenny hung in the air. Medics tended to wounded soldiers, American and German alike. French prisoners embraced their liberators, tears streaming down faces that had spent years behind walls. The body of Major Josef Gangl lay in the castle chapel, covered with both American and German flags, a gesture without precedent in the war. The war in Europe would officially end 2 days later when Germany signed unconditional surrender documents on May 7, 1945. But at Castle Itter, the war had already revealed its final truth: that shared humanity could transcend national allegiance, that moral courage could emerge even in a regime's darkest collapse, and that the most powerful weapon was not the 88mm gun or the Sherman tank, but the individual choice to protect life rather than take it. The Battle of Castle Itter was not a major engagement. It did not change the war's outcome, influence strategic decisions, or appear in military academy textbooks. But it represented something more important than tactical significance. It demonstrated that even in total war, with nations committed to mutual destruction, individual soldiers could recognize their common humanity with former enemies and act accordingly. Major Gangl chose to defend French prisoners against his own countrymen. Captain Lee chose to fight alongside enemy soldiers to protect innocent lives. Wehrmacht troops chose conscience over regime loyalty. French prisoners chose active resistance over passive victimhood. And together, for a few desperate hours, they created something unprecedented: an alliance based not on national interest, but on the simple recognition that some principles, protecting the innocent, opposing fanatical evil, choosing courage over expedience, transcended the uniforms they wore. The lesson of Castle Itter is not that war brings out nobility in soldiers. War is brutal, destructive, and dehumanizing. The lesson is that even within war's brutality, individuals retain moral agency. They can choose to follow orders or violate them. They can choose loyalty to regime or loyalty to conscience. They can choose to see enemies as humans or as targets. At Castle Itter, on the last day of meaningful combat in the European theater of World War II, a small group of Americans, Germans, and French made those choices. They chose humanity over ideology. They chose cooperation over enmity. They chose to fight together against a common evil rather than fight each other out of habit or orders. One of them, Major Josef Gangl, died for that choice, killed saving a man who had been his nation's enemy just days earlier. His death was not in vain. The prisoners survived. The fanatical SS attack was defeated, and history recorded the only instance of American and German soldiers fighting side by side as allies in World War II. The castle still stands in the Austrian Alps, a medieval fortress that witnessed something medieval walls could never have imagined: a battle where yesterday's enemies became today's allies, where uniforms mattered less than conscience, and where the strangest alliance of the war achieved something simple and profound. It saved innocent lives in a conflict that had destroyed millions. That is the story of Castle Itter. Not a strategic turning point, not a decisive engagement. Just a few hours where a small group of soldiers, regardless of the flags they had fought under, recognized that protecting human life was more important than following orders, more meaningful than national loyalty, and more valuable than ideological purity. In the end, perhaps that recognition was the only victory that truly mattered.